you take notes on every lecture?
Okay. So welcome everybody. I get to be in multiple roles tonight. Also need what I'm saying. So thank you for all of those who have come out this evening. My name is Dr. Christopher Sheklian. I am the director of the Zorab Information Center, the Krikor and Clara Zorab Information Center here at the diocese. I'm pleased to have His Grace Bishop Daniel Fendikian with us, the prior director of the Zorab Information Center, and the person who has kind of set the parameters for a lot of what we do here, so it's wonderful. And who knows, many technological difficulties today because I get to do multiple things. So as many of you know, the way that I've been doing these enrichment evenings since I have started as director is to have sort of thematic series that run over a season, several weeks, a month, several months. So what we're doing for the winter and spring is a series on the environment. And not all of the events are going to necessarily be directly about the environment. There will be sort of the series, and then there are some other additional lectures. I'm thrilled to actually announce the next lecture, which will be our own Deacon Timothy. And in fact, I am going to be kind of introducing this idea that is going to organize the theme for the rest of the series. So I've commissioned some other folks to come and talk about this idea of the environment. And over the course of my talk today, you're going to sort of see what those people are going to be doing, and you're going to see what we even kind of mean. So the title of my talk tonight is Toward an Environmental Theology of the Armenian Church, as I cover it. So the toward here is because it kind of doesn't really exist yet. So we're going to sketch some things out today, and over the course of this series, we're going to get some ideas out there to see what this might look like. So we'll see how this works. Oh, did I not turn this on either? There we go. Man, all my technology is not going to work today. That's fine. So this is I'm going to read this in Armenian for fun because here is the translation of it. This translation is my very quick and dirty translation. So everybody who has any Karapar skills, please don't skewer me, but maybe you can give me corrections afterwards. So it's Ortnyader yev spasag darvo kakstru chanko ziliu champ yev kagu champ gadarestsi Ortnyader us shtemaranus soreno yev unhansanus Kinvo yev yugyo ziletsjalk haradutene pariatskots aravel yeves pkhestsen astkoin ansud panit Yete yergink lvitsen yergri yev yergir lvitse tsoreno yev kino yev tsito yev nokok litsi joghovurtim yevas mez zamenesyan arjani arahagu cham vayeleles barkeves arad vohormuchanko yev kohanalov paravoriel as kez antwortvo yev antservo hokvuin aijam yev mish yev havidjanes havidenitz. Amen. So this is the end of a little prayer. This beautiful little thing is the end of a prayer recited by a priest during the service of blessing for a field, seeds, grain, and vats, like what you put the wine in. It is the last portion of a longer prayer, the beginning of which makes reference to lightning, rain, the waters of the seas. Here's our vats here. Oh, I guess not. Oh, well, luckily they weren't very important pictures. The beginning of this prayer makes reference to lightning, rain, the waters of the seas. It asks that the rain should fall and the crops should succeed by the mercy of God despite the sins of humanity. The prayer presents a set of connections between God, humanity, and the natural world, God's creation, where the health of creation is not separate from the activity of either God or humanity. It links humanity's relationship with God to the health and functioning of the environment. Such a complex, interconnected ecology where humanity is clearly placed within God's creation, yet holding a special place within it, could be found in any number of prayers of the Armenian Apostolic Church. The Armenian Church's liturgy is rich in services that make reference to water, soil, the earth, animals. In short, to what Christians for millennia have known as God's creation, and what we today would variously call nature, the ecosystem, or following the theme of the seasons series, the environment. This little-known service from the Mashtots, the Book of Rituals of the Armenian Apostolic Church, is one of the most explicit liturgical services to make reference to the environment, right? It references field, seeds, grain, and the things that you put in the vats, wine, oil. But we might consider two more prominent ones. The Antastan, or Blessing of the Field service, conducted several times a year in its most complete version on the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross. Right? Everybody knows probably this one. It includes everybody's favorite rollicking hymn, Amen, Ein, Alleluia. You process around, and the priest blesses all four corners of the world. Another one would be the blessing of water performed on Epiphany, Armenian Christmas. These beloved and more well-known services make use of natural elements. Water, basil adorns the cross, most notably, and are blessings of and for God's creation. As Bishop Daniel Findikian, among others, has noted, the theology of the Armenian Church is best found in its liturgy. If that is the case, then the theology of the Armenian Church has much to say about the environment. Now, other Christian churches and denominations have already, for several decades, been talking about the environment. Under the label of environmental theology, eco-theology, green theology, or simply care for God's creation, the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church in particular, and more recently joined by several Protestant denominations, have turned their attention to the proper place of humanity in God's creation. Perhaps this might seem merely a trendy turn toward an agenda set by secular philosophers and activists. Yet the theologians of the Catholic and Orthodox churches articulating this eco-theology insist that their churches have long been concerned with the proper role of humanity's place in God's creation. Orthodox practices of fasting, Cappadocian fathers developing a robust theological anthropology, and St. Francis of Assisi's tender comportment to all of God's creatures are just some of the things that they point to. If the rest of the world, they suggest, has finally caught on to the importance of an integrated and respectful understanding of humanity's place in the complex ecosystem that makes up planet Earth, then the churches might as well share their insights. I would also insist that if the church has something relevant to add to a debate raging across the planet with implications for all of humanity, then joining the debate and developing an environmental theology is not simply trendy, but good pastoral practice, good ministry, good witnessing. If the church can add something important, and crucially, something that points to the truth of God's love, Christ's incarnation, and the constant action of the Holy Spirit that the church professes, if it can add this to questions and concerns currently debated the entire earth over, then it would not only be remiss of the church not to do it, it is in fact the church's responsibility. Christianity, and as I will begin to show tonight, Armenian Christianity, has something unique to offer the contemporary debates about the environment and the place and role of humanity in nature. Crucially, as with any other of the ancient and traditional Christian churches, this theological reflection cannot be invented out of thin air. Tradition, following both the understanding of the church and the brilliant philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, is not inert or unchanging. Rather, tradition is the constant renewal and reapplication of the inheritance we have been given in order to meet the needs of the present. Tradition is not a static insistence on the way things have always been done, but a blueprint and a toolbox for how to live in the present. In the case of environmental theology, it is both important to recognize, but ultimately kind of irrelevant, that St. Gregory of Nyssa or St. Gregory of Noteg did not explicitly write about ecology or the environment. Rather, we today, meeting new challenges and entering new debates, can recognize that their discussions of humanity, God's creation, human nature, and created nature can all be used to help us face today's challenges. How should we live in a global, interconnected world? What responsibility do we owe animals and plant life in the places we live? To what extent does human action influence the natural world? These questions, so pressing today, can also be debated using the insights of the great theologians of the past. Simply because they did not explicitly write a tract about human responsibility to the environment and endangered species, does not mean that their concepts and arguments are irrelevant to the topic. Instead, contemporary theologians must carefully and conscientiously appeal to that great tradition in order to meet the needs of the present. This will require translation, not simply out of classical Armenian into English or French or modern Armenian, but translation of concepts and concerns into present terminology, translation from their world into ours. Done respectfully and carefully, this is not cynical or inappropriate appropriation, but rather exactly what tradition is, using the insights and prayers of centuries of Armenian Christian saints and scholars to grapple with our problems today. Such a use of the rich Armenian theological tradition is pretty new. Viken Goroyan, esteemed Armenian and Orthodox ethicist and theologian, first articulated what he called the ecological spirituality of the Armenian Church in a 1991 article entitled Cleansers of the Whole Earth. And I really take this to be sort of the first and in some ways really one of the only articulations of what the Armenian Church might think on this topic explicitly, right? To have the sort of the phrase, the ecological spirituality of the Armenian Church. He drew on liturgical services, especially the Madach service of sacrifice found in the Mashtots, very close actually to the service with which we began. In this article, as well as in his beautiful books on gardening, Goroyan was one of the first to recognize that the rich heritage of Armenian Christianity could speak to contemporary concerns about nature and ecology. As with the Catholic and Orthodox theologians working on this topic, Goroyan insisted that the Armenian Church has always had an ecological spirituality. The difference, really, is simply that today we use words like ecology. Goroyan saw that the Armenian Church, too, has always had something to say about humanity's place in God's creation. The crucial step is to use those insights, those liturgical services, those beautiful prayers, those deep theological texts, to explicitly enter a contemporary conversation about nature, ecology, and the environment. This is what we mean by eco-theology, green theology, or environmental theology. Put simply, environmental theology is the use of ancient Christian wisdom about humanity's place in God's creation to meet contemporary challenges related to nature, ecology, and the environment. I'm going to pause, and this is kind of an aside, but I'm going to say this paragraph, and then we can maybe be angry at me later. But I want to be clear that this does not immediately or necessarily entail a particular politics. If we understand politics as the question of how exactly to organize the common good, it's a sad testament to our current state of affairs that simply mentioning the environment seems to place one in a political box. I want to categorically reject this notion. Speaking about ecology, the environment, or nature, especially from the Christian perspective of care for God's creation, has no immediately political position. Assuredly, as with most things we do, the insights we develop or the possibilities we point to may and can and probably will be taken up in the pursuit of the organization of the common good, politics. But, if done properly, environmental theology will produce insights that help us ethically and ecclesially, that is, how to live well and how to function as a church, before they can be taken up politically. If we are careful theologians discussing humanity's place in God's creation, the insights of our ancient church might very well be put to different and opposing political positions. In their own right, though, these positions should not be explicitly political, especially if by this we mean narrow partisan politics. So there's my caveat, okay? I think that we can do this work without immediately jumping into narrow political debates. I just want to make that clear. So what then does such an environmental or eco-theology look like? What topics does it address? How can it come to impact our lives? To answer this question, and basically what I'm going to do from here on out, I'm going to address some of the starting points for eco-theology generally. Then I'm going to turn to some of the work that's already been done in the Catholic and Orthodox churches. These churches, while historically distinct from the Armenian Apostolic Church and with certain notable theological differences, nonetheless share the Armenian Church's apostolic foundations and reliance on early Christian patristic texts. All of these churches are apostolic, traditional, and highly liturgical. Thus, while the emergent position of the Armenian Church on the environment will certainly have its differences, and indeed, hopefully, its unique contributions, the work that has already been done in these churches can help do two things. First, They determine the contours of the ecumenical conversation as it already exists. Okay, in other words, the Armenian Church is not inventing Christian reflection on the environment in a vacuum. This is a conversation that other Christian churches have been having for decades. So if we are to develop some kind of position on it, we are entering a conversation that other Christians have already been having, and we should be aware of what that conversation is. Second, because of the similarities between our churches, as well as the shared texts, not least of all, of course, the Bible itself, the insights of the Catholic and Orthodox churches can help chart a path for the development of a green theology in the Armenian Church. I limit myself to these two churches not only because of time, but because the patristic and liturgical emphasis of the two churches mirrors our own. We have much to learn from other Christian denominations on this topic as well, but for charting a course forward, we will begin from the work done in the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches. Finally, to finish the talk, we'll return to the Armenian liturgical and theological world in order to begin to chart a way forward. Many of the ideas of Christian ecological thinking begin, appropriately, from the book of Genesis, right? Genesis, beginning, makes sense. Given that Christian environmental thinking is often described as a consideration for the care for God's creation, the narrative of that creation is the logical starting point. However, at this point, we sort of immediately hit a snag. And this snag is the oft-quoted verse of Genesis 1:28. And I'm going to give it here both in classical Armenian and in English, not just because I like reading in classical Armenian. You'll see the reason in a little bit. So, «Եվ որ տնյաց ասնոսա աստված եւ ասե, աջեցեք, եւ բազմացարվոք եւ լցեք ձեր գիր, եւ դիրեցեք թմա, եւ իշխեցեք ձնգած ծովու եւ թրջնոց երկնից եւ ամենայն անասանոց, եւ ամենյան սողնոց որ սողին ի վերա երկրի. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Again, Genesis 1:28. So why does this cause trouble? Well, there's two little words in there that people have pointed to, specifically subdue and dominion. They've led to some specific interpretations that have not really led to the care of God's creation, but rather unbounded and cynical use of that creation. Most famously, in a 1967 essay by Lynn White Jr., The Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, White argued for what has since become known after him as the White Thesis, that Christianity bears a huge burden of guilt for the contemporary ecological crisis because in Christian belief, the natural world has no other purpose than to serve man's needs. Unquote. From a reading of Genesis 1:28 that emphasizes dominion and subduing, many Christians have in fact, again this is White, insisted that it is God's will that man exploit nature for his proper ends. So any Christian eco-theology must have an answer to White's thesis. Some Orthodox theologians have tried to avoid the blame, saying while this might have been true of Western Christianity, it was never true of Eastern Christianity. Some of the Orthodox theologians try this route. Others have countered the White thesis by emphasizing stewardship, pointing to other passages in Genesis, for instance, Adam's naming of the animals, where it's clear that subdue and dominion might not be the best English words for what Adam actually does. So this leads to a question of what it means to subdue, or to have dominion over, and leads to an extended discussion of humanity's relationship to these elements of creation. I quote the Armenian because when translating, different words have different valence. So the question that we could maybe start with, one possible starting point for an Armenian eco-theology is, do the words direl and ishchel have the same connotation as subdue and have dominion over? In English, these words conjure violent conquest. In Armenian, they do not necessarily have such a strong connotation. One avenue for Armenian eco-theology, then, would be the careful consideration of what these two terms mean. God's deruchun, his dominion, is often evoked in Armenian prayers, and the term shows up in Armenian histories like Khorenatsi and the Buzandaran. An Armenian contribution to the conversation about Christianity and the environment, then, might include the careful exegesis, the careful commentary on Genesis 1:28. including a thorough examination of what these terms mean in Armenian. Such a reading could lead other Christian traditions to reevaluate how they have interpreted this passage. So there's one starting point. So if every Christian tradition which has developed a green theology must contend with the white thesis, there's also plenty of other starting points. Most prominently, Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, or On the Care for Our Common Home, which was his second encyclical as Pope, develops an argument for careful attention to God's creation. He draws heavily on his namesake, St. Francis of Assisi. The Little Flowers of St. Francis, a beautiful little book that recalls important moments in the life of the saint, provides a starting point for Pope Francis's text. The Pope writes, "Francis helps us to see that an integral ecology calls for openness to categories which transcend the language of mathematics and biology and takes us to the heart of what it is to be human. Just as happens when we fall in love with someone, whenever he would gaze at the sun, the moon, or the smallest of animals, he burst into song, drawing all other creatures into his praise. He communed with all creation, even preaching to the flowers, inviting them to praise the Lord just as if they were endowed with reason." So St. Francis's response to the world around him was so much more than intellectual appreciation or economic calculus. For him, each and every creature was a sister united to him by bonds of affection. This is still Pope Francis. That is why he called to care for all that exists. The encyclical, just like the Armenian prayer with which we began, traces a kind of integral ecology where God, humanity, and the rest of creation are all together in a delicate balance. Remarkably, just as the Armenian prayer invokes human sin in connection with the rains and other natural forces, making it clear that human interaction with each other is not outside the concern of an integral ecology, Pope Francis connects the state of human society to the state of nature. Ultimately, human beings who in Christian anthropology are distinct in their ability to have rational thought, right? This is like one of the key ideas, is that humans are rational. This is taken up in other philosophy, but it's absolutely integral to all Christian understandings of what human beings are. Some people even see human rationality as what makes us in the image of God. So in any Christian anthropology, the reasoning powers of humans are part of what are supposed to set us apart. So with that rational thought, humans are called to consider their relations with each other as well as the rest of the world. This leads to a notion of stewardship rather than domination. Thus, Pope Francis writes, "This responsibility for God's earth means that human beings, endowed with intelligence, must respect the laws of nature and the delicate equilibria existing between the creatures of this world. For he commanded and they were created, and he established them forever and ever. He fixed their bounds, and he set a law which cannot pass away." That's Psalm 148. The laws found in the Bible dwell on relationships, not only among individuals, but also with other living beings. End of Pope Francis's quote. From this Catholic perspective, the unique attributes of humanity entail a responsibility to the rest of God's creation. Other than the Bible and St. Francis of Assisi, the person Pope Francis quotes most often in his encyclical Laudato Si is Patriarch Bartholomew I, the ecumenical patriarch of the Orthodox Church, whose his seat is in Istanbul. Patriarch Bartholomew, over the past 30 years, has supported so many environmental initiatives that he's earned the nickname the Green Patriarch. In addition to conferences and summits, including the third Halki Summit in Istanbul last June, which I was privileged to attend, and about which Deacon Alex Sheklian will tell us more in just a couple weeks, Patriarch Bartholomew has fostered a rich theological discussion of environmental theology. This coming June, at the Grey Moor Ecumenical and Interreligious Institute near Columbia University, the Zorab Center is going to be co-hosting an event that includes on the panel Reverend Dr. John Chrysavgis, whose official title is the Advisor to the Ecumenical Patriarch on Environmental Issues. Reverend John, in addition to many others, has been at the forefront of the rich and sophisticated, and it's like really kind of intense theology, that the Orthodox Church has developed. When he's here, and hopefully we're going to have him here as well, if you look at the full schedule, we're for sure certain up at the Grey Moor Institute near Columbia on the 5th, on Friday. We're hoping he's going to be here on the 4th as well, June 4th. We're still sort of figuring that out. So he'll obviously be able to discuss his work better than I can. But here, because he's been so much at the forefront of the Orthodox Church's position, I'm going to give a little bit of his insights. And according to him and another author, he says, for Orthodox Christian philosophers and theologians, the concern for the environment is not a form of superficial or sentimental love. It is a way of honoring and dignifying God. In other words, not only is Orthodox environmental theology not merely a trendy response to current political currents, right? We talked about at the beginning. Neither is it sort of worship of nature for the sake of nature. It's grounded in a fundamental affirmation of God's action and activity in the world. For Orthodox Christians, these authors want to suggest, ecological concern is a mode of recognizing the power and authority of God. It's a form of glorifying Him, or even a prayer. Such a concern demonstrates that Christians recognize the good world that God has created. That's ecological theology is a way of recognizing that God did something good. The starting point for this Orthodox perspective, we can see, is actually quite different from other forms of environmentalism. This does not mean that they can't be in dialogue or that they don't work to similar ends. It simply means that for a Christian, the environment is ultimately God's creation, and therefore the impulse to treat it well derives from a fundamentally theological starting point, the recognition of God's creative activity and a Christian response of thankfulness for that activity. In another essay, Christoph-Gies articulates three helpful ways the theology of the Orthodox Church can restore within ourselves a sense of wonder before God's creation. And I think that that's actually a really lovely and apt description of what environmental theology is all about. Earlier, right, I gave a kind of more, it is the use of Christian wisdom to confront sort of ecology, Christian wisdom about God's creation, confronting contemporary concerns about environment and ecology. That's a fine definition. But I actually really like this little phrase because I think it points to what the goal of maybe a Christian eco-theology is. So I'll repeat this, that we can restore within ourselves a sense of wonder before God's creation. So Christoph-Gies suggests that these three things are, one, through icons, namely, he says, the way we perceive creation, liturgy, the way we celebrate creation, and asceticism, the way we respect creation. So let me briefly unravel these three helpful ways that Christoph-Gies points to. As many of you perhaps know, icons, usually paintings depicting saints or important scenes from the Bible, the life of Christ, or the history of the church, are central to the theology and the practice of the Orthodox Church, right? Armenians have icons, but if you walked into like a Greek Orthodox church, the difference between those two is palpable, right? We've got them. The Orthodox Church is full of them, okay? Separating the altar from congregants is what is known as an iconostasis, a beautifully fully painted wooden screen covered in icons, right? So the Greek, the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox versus our church's practice with icons is different, right? We're fine with icons. We love them. We have beautiful ones. But the extent to which we rely on them is just a different order of magnitude. So according to Christoph-Gies, seeing clearly is precisely what icons teach us to do. The world of the icon offers new insights into reality. So in the history of art, Byzantine art, especially Orthodox icons, have sometimes been denigrated for their lack of realism. Everything from the way they depict human faces, to the arrangement of space, the way buildings look, the juxtaposition of people and places that are clearly coming from different spaces and times, has been sort of critiqued sometimes in art history. This is older art history, actually. This is nobody in the last 20 years would sort of say that, but this in the sort of the history of art history, this was a position on Byzantine icons. However, the point of an icon, what Christoph-Gies is highlighting here, is that icons are not intended to depict reality as humans perceive it, the realism of art history. Rather, they're intended to depict what Christians believe is a more fundamental reality, the truth of God, not what humans see. Icons then are an opportunity for the Christian to encounter God's reality and to see it clearly. This is Christoph-Gies. The icon articulates with theological conviction our faith in the heavenly kingdom. It does away with any objective distance between this world and the next, between the material and the spiritual, between body and soul, time and eternity, creation and divinity. So two additional aspects of the theology of icons are crucial here. First, icons are always related to the doctrine of the Incarnation. The Incarnation in Christian belief is the coming of the Son of God, the Word of God, into the world as the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus makes God present, manifest, visible, and to some degree knowable to humanity. Through his incarnation, divinity becomes a little more accessible to humanity. In Orthodox thinking, most famously in the work of St. John of Damascus, who wrote in the 8th century, the justification and the power of icons comes from the Incarnation. Icons, too, make present and visible God's reality. Okay, so if the Incarnation, through the coming of the Word of God into the world, is a way of making the divinity present into the world, Orthodox theologians for centuries have argued that that's also what icons do. They make divinity a little bit more accessible. That's why they're not supposed to look perfectly realistic in the sort of artistic sense. They present a different kind of reality. They make God's reality somehow accessible to us. Secondly, in Orthodox thinking, the whole world could be an icon. Approached with Christian wonder, the world itself, all of creation, helps the Christian to see and know God. If this is true, that icons and creation alike must function as crystal clear windows into God's reality. The second helpful way to restore a sense of wonder, according to Chrysostom, is liturgy. Liturgy is the corporate, traditional worship of the assembled church. This includes, of course, the divine liturgy in Armenian Bararak, but it also includes all the daily offices, the morning and evening services, as well as all the little services in the mashtots, such as the one that we started with, the prayer that I read at the very beginning. Liturgy, Chrysostom says, is precisely the commemoration of this innate connection between God and people and things. It is a celebration of the sense of communion. It is the dance of life. And he's quoting a wonderful, great Orthodox theologian, Sheklian, there with the dance of life. Beautiful little image. Moreover, he says, liturgy implores God for the renewal of the whole polluted cosmos. We can see this in the Armenian liturgical rites for Christmas and the blessing of the waters. Crucially, according to many Orthodox thinkers, and Armenians can be included among them, the Incarnation, the coming of God into the world through Jesus Christ, not only repairs the broken relationship between humanity and God, but in fact renews the entire world. In liturgy, Christian churches enact this renewal, coming into communion with each other, with God, and with all of God's plan, including all of the created world. Liturgy itself offers a chance for this renewal. Finally, Chrysostom suggests the importance of an ascetic model, with what he calls the 3 R's of the ascetic life: renunciation, repentance, and responsibility. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to talk a little bit about renunciation, which he says is a way of learning to share. Therefore, it has social consequences. It reminds us to use material good respectfully. Renunciation is about living simply and simply living. That's Chrysostom. Of course, the most common ascetic practice is fasting, practiced by the Armenian Church traditionally on Wednesdays and Fridays, as well as in other seasons such as Great Lent, quickly approaching. Of fasting, another Orthodox author writes, by fasting, man obediently accepts the divine commandment so that he can grow into the likeness of God. In so doing, he recognizes his created nature. In other words, he acknowledges that his very being is on loan. In the opposite case, the thoughtless use of the fruits of nature, which is associated with disobedience, shows in practice that man doubts that his created nature is borrowed. This has led man to his estrangement and alienation from God, but has also condemned all of creation that groaneth and travaileth in pain together until now. End of quote. The same writer continues later. Abstinence from meat, observed by monks all year long and by the rest of Orthodox Christians on the 2 fasting days during the week and the 4 Lents of the ecclesiastical year, limits the amount of death we provoke in our relationship to the world. Thus, the institution of fasting is not unrelated to ecology, since it consists of practical position regarding consumption. Abstinence from certain foods simultaneously aims at protecting, even for a short period of time, animals that in great numbers are cruelly devoured by man. End of quote. In the Old Testament, God commands the Hebrew tribes to allow fields to fallow, and in multiples of 7 years, 70 years, to give rest to the land and to the animals. In addition to a recognition of God's authority, this is good agricultural practice. In fact, one of the traditional calving seasons falls mid-February to mid-April, precisely the season of Lent. In other words, the time when the regeneration of flocks and herds occurs is exactly the time when the church prescribes the eating of meat. Fasting and other ascetic practices are intimately linked to the health of the earth and God's creation. So there's a whole bunch of other Orthodox insights we could follow. Okay, these are the sort of the main ones that one of the main theologians doing this has pointed to. A couple others that are worth sort of just mentioning. One, we've already talked about the doctrine of the incarnation a little bit. Another really big one is sacramental theology. This is another sort of place where the Orthodox have really done some sophisticated thinking about what their sort of theology, eco-theology looks like. So Orthodox environmental theology is highly developed and sophisticated. Many of the theological arguments rely on careful readings of the patristic texts of the Orthodox Church, and they develop out of long-standing positions of that church. So, I mean, it's like really quite sophisticated theology, some of which goes above my head. I'm a dabbler in theology. I'm an amateur theologian, really, and it's pretty robust and developed. And I want to also sort of reemphasize that these positions were not always explicitly deployed for environmental concerns. Many of these concerns are new or sort of appear differently in our age than they do in the past. The point is that the Orthodox theological tradition provides insights relevant to these new, specifically ecological concerns. If this is true of the Catholic and Orthodox churches, it's equally true and certainly possible for the Armenian Apostolic Church. So I'm going to turn then and end with a few potential ideas which an Armenian eco-theology might develop further. And this really is like I'm sort of like pointing flags and chopping a few weeds so that you can maybe see the path that people could go down. And my ultimate goal is that people, hopefully other people who are more sophisticated theologians than I am, will take those paths. Because I think that we have something to offer this conversation. So with this sort of background of the Catholic and the Orthodox, what they have done, I'm going to sort of suggest a few ideas that come out of Armenian theological thinking that might be the way that we could go. So it really is my conviction that these fruitful routes can contribute to this bigger Christian dialogue. And I think that the unique position of the Armenian Church might suggest new paths for other folks to follow as well. So let's start from the question of the incarnation. We've got this signpost from the Orthodox Church, which has already insisted that this is important for thinking about environmental theology. But the Armenian understanding of the incarnation is subtly different from that of the Orthodox and Catholic Church. Without delving too deep into the details here, as I said, my goal is only to sort of pull the brush away a little bit. We can recall that the Armenian Apostolic Church, along with all the so-called Oriental Orthodox churches, never accepted the doctrine of Christology promulgated by the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD. Okay, so you can bear with me here. Christology is the branch of theology answering the question, who is Jesus Christ? While the answer maybe seems clear to us, although if you scratch the surface a little bit, it gets complicated really quickly. In the aftermath of the events of Christ's ministry, not everybody was clear on it. We see this even in the gospel accounts. When Jesus asked his disciples who they thought he was and who people were saying he was, they gave many answers. A prophet, John the Baptist, a reincarnation of older prophets. Only Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Except even this was a little bit confusing. Early on, the Universal Church agreed that Jesus Christ was both God and man. The question became, how? Right? How are you both of those things simultaneously? So the Council of Chalcedon answers with this famous formula, Jesus Christ is two natures, God and man, in one person. Right? God and man united in the person of Jesus Christ. Except for the fact that many churches, including our own, did not care for the way this seemed to separate out the natures of Christ. Right? You're saying there's two of them. Instead, they leaned heavily on the formula of Cyril of Alexandria, one incarnate nature of the God Logos. This is super complicated. The Armenian Church preaches Jesus Christ as one person, one nature, God and man, without division or mixing. Now this is, of course, a little bit mystical. How are you one nature, God and man, without division, without mixing? It's a complicated question. And we're not going to solve it tonight, and we're not going to get it perfectly tonight. The point here, though, is that for our purposes, the Armenian Church is preaching one nature, God and man, as opposed to two natures. This means that the Armenian concept of panuchun, nature, might be just a little bit different than the Catholic or Orthodox ones. In Armenian, as in English, Nature, panouchion, can cover the meaning both of human nature and of the created world, nature, the environment. In other words, the very concept of nature, of the environment, is defined with a slight difference in the Armenian Church. Nature is God and man. There is this weird idea that you can put these things together without separating them out. So that means the way that you're thinking about nature is different from the outset. Now, I don't want to turn this into a major sort of like big thing, because despite centuries of disagreement, many theologians have decided that the two positions are in pretty close equality, that they're just kind of different ways of saying the same thing. And in fact, good ecumenical dialogue in the 20th century has really tried to bring the churches together in order to say, you know what, let's not fight about this in the way that we did for hundreds of years. But I do want to suggest that from the outset, the idea of nature is posited a little bit differently. An idea of nature or matter that's less separate from divinity could very well open up new insights into humanity's relationship with both nature and the divine. It seems to me then that Christology and the doctrine of the Incarnation is one extremely important place from which to develop a unique Armenian environmental theology. So another place to start, which I kind of alluded to earlier, is on our understanding of the Genesis narrative. Right? We talked about, does dominion, deruchun, mean the same thing as dominion? And if so, what does that mean? The Armenian theological tradition has a highly developed genre of biblical as well as other commentaries. Armenian Vartabeds, these scholar monks, have written sophisticated commentaries, exegesis on many biblical books, including the book of Genesis. Dr. Edward Matthews, a former professor at St. Narcissus Armenian Seminary, has studied the Armenian commentary on Genesis attributed to St. Ephrem the Syrian. St. Ephrem, one of the great saints of the early church, revered by all the ancient churches, was known for his commentaries as well as for his beautiful hymns. The commentary on Genesis attributed to him in Armenian differs from versions that are attributed to him in both Syriac and Greek. So in other words, there's a commentary on Genesis by St. Ephrem in Armenian, in Greek, and in Syriac, and they're all a little bit different. No matter, the commentary itself in its Armenian version was highly influential on subsequent Armenian thinking. Just one excerpt points to a line of thought that could be developed. Commenting on the deliverance of Lot from the destruction of Sodom, the commentator writes, "It was not that he was making entreaty only concerning the just, that in the end they should be delivered, but also concerning the land, that it should be delivered for the sake of the just." As with the prayer with which we began, also here in the commentary tradition, we find this complex connection between land, human activity and sin, and God's love and justice. Right? Where God delivers Lot from Sodom and wants the land to be healthy for the sake of the just. There's this connection between humans, the land, and God's love and justice. This is just one line from one commentary. In addition to this commentary on Genesis, Armenians who wrote commentaries on Genesis include Vartan Araveltsi, Hovannes Verotnetsi, the famous teacher of Kodatevatsi, who himself wrote a commentary on Genesis. In addition to these, there's fragmentary commentaries on Genesis. Many of these have never been published, even in Armenian. They're sitting in manuscript form, waiting for their secrets to be unlocked. And once people look at these commentaries on Genesis, then we can bring those insights, just like that one little line, into the thinking about the relationship between humanity, God, and nature. It's from these sorts of places that an Armenian eco-theology is going to become robust. As we've seen, of course, the liturgical services of the Armenian Church are rich in references to water, soil, earth, animals, and many other parts of nature. Armenians bless the natural world, ask God for fruitful harvests, and recognize the place of human action in the natural world. Armenian theology is largely to be found in its liturgy, especially in the beautiful and complex hymns known as the Sharagans. In addition to the prayers and services already alluded to, hundreds of sophisticated hymns should be mined for their insights. St. Narcissus, one of the most revered saints of the Armenian Church, wrote a hymn sung at the end of the morning service known as the Hymn for the Days of Creation. Many of us might know the final set of stanzas, beginning with Nora Stegzial, meaning basically recreated. This reflects the beautiful idea of the Armenian Apostolic Church that Sunday is the day of renewal, God's day of new creation. And that's just the Sunday hymn. Each of the hymns of St. Narcissus that are sung on different days at that moment are dedicated to the idea of the days of creation. So here's a gem of insights into creation, humanity, and renewal. crucial themes in any environmental theology hiding in plain sight, something we sing every Sunday. I could, of course, continue with examples and suggestions well into the night. I'm not going to, don't worry. I've not mentioned Armenian thinking on fasting, several patristic texts that have been translated to English by both Bishop Daniel and Dr. Abraham Tarian. There's some really good stuff that you can find in English on fasting that were written by Armenian theologians. Nor have we done anything more than scratch the surface of the relevant liturgical services. That's precisely the point. The Armenian Apostolic Church is a rich treasury of theological thinking related to the complex interplay between God, humanity, and the created world, what Pope Francis, among others, has called integrated ecology. To use Chrysostom's beautiful calque on the goal of environmental theology, all of the beautiful hymns, commentaries, and theological tracts of the Armenian Apostolic Church can help restore within ourselves a sense of wonder before God's creation. I truly believe that the Armenian Church has much to offer both the ecumenical Christian conversation about environmental theology as well as broader conversations happening today about the environment and the place of humans in the world at large. My humble hope is that the Armenian Church can wield the unique and beautiful tools of its theology to develop such an environmental theology of the Armenian Church. Thank you. So my pictures, they weren't totally relevant anyways, but they didn't work. We had all kinds of technological difficulties, so you just had to listen to me. I know it was dense. The goal was to lay out some things that hopefully other people will pick up. I promise to do some of the work, but I'm not that sophisticated of a theologian. I need other people to do it, and that is my goal, is to just sort of lay out some thoughts. So if you have questions about what those routes might be, or if you want me to try to clarify, I will still not be able to explain Miaphysite Christology in perfect clarity to you if you ask the question, but I am more than happy to take questions. Florence!
One of the great problems that we're facing today in terms of ecology is climate change. And you mentioned the work that has been done with the Orthodox as well as the Armenian Church. Have any of the Protestant churches come up with any ideas on this?
They have.
And why hasn't it been used to counter all those arguments that there is no such thing as climate change taking place? Why isn't there more of a theological approach that large segments of this country who believe that there is no climate change and who are Christian, why aren't they following these concepts?
That I could not tell you, but there is actually a pretty robust Protestant, varying, Protestant is a big term, but a number of different Protestant, even evangelical positions on this. If you look up Care for God's Creation, if you get on Amazon and search eco-theology, you're going to find a whole bunch of stuff written by varying people from Protestant denominations. It's out there. There's a little group that I've attended a couple meetings here in New York City called C4, Christians Concerned About Climate Change. So they're out there. There is Protestant thinking on it. I didn't emphasize it today because, well, I already talked for a really long time, but also because, as I mentioned, in terms of trying to think about a starting point for the Armenian Church, the Orthodox and Catholic churches are just going to give us a little bit more. They're starting from the same place. They're reading Gregory of Nyssa. They're reading these sort of fathers. They have a liturgical sensibility in a way that most Protestant churches just don't. And that's, not to be mean. It's simply the reality of the way that those churches have developed. So that's why I did that today. But it's out there. There is a varying Protestant denominations and individuals from Protestant denominations have articulated, this sort of creation care idea. It's there. Now, why has it not caught on? Why don't people take it up? That's a different question, and not one that I certainly could.
Certainly hasn't caught on to this whatsoever. All you're hearing about is that there is no such thing, and that some of these scientists are kind of loony to begin with. Why hasn't this caught on in terms of publicity?
I don't want to delve too deep into trying to figure all of this out. I'm super interested in kind of I'm hoping, my training is an anthropologist, so I can do a little bit of theology when I put my brain to it, but I'm actually really interested in looking at what people are actually doing. So I'm hoping to kind of write a little bit about some of these groups and what they're doing, which I hope will be a way of presenting the fact that they exist and that they're out there, because you're right, not everybody knows about Protestant creation care. Sure. Yeah.
This may be just not just for environment or ecology, but any sort of good deed. That's not a very high bar to say that being good to nature is like the godly thing to do. But how does theology or church deal with the argument that sometimes doing the right thing actually costs money? And I say this as a driver of a hybrid with panels on my roof that charge that. It all has a little cost.
Right.
So what is the, how does church or theology overcome the argument of the cost of doing the right thing?
Yeah, right. I think that's a really important question, and one of the things, Deacon Alex, when he speaks in a few weeks, I love the guy, and he is very focused on, all right, fine, this is beautiful, this is interesting, this is sophisticated, what do we do with it? How do we get people to take it and change their lives with it? Or even come up with what they should do to change their lives with it. So, what you're hinting at, I think, is super crucial. The first thing to say is simply that I think a lot of what I have been pointing to is really focused on the sort of the first step of saying, actually, this is something to do. Yeah, no. I'm totally, yeah.
Doing the right thing when it costs money.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a hybrid car. Any right deed that costs money.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a tough sell, and I think one of the things I quoted from one of the Orthodox theologians was something about to simply live and to live simply. But we're not all going to go be monks. We're not all going to immediately become vegan. We're certainly not all going to live an existence where we only walk within a 6-mile radius or something like that. So. Yeah, absolutely. This is sort of the practical question, I think. How do people change their behavior when it's tough? And that's a hard sell, actually. So another one of the women down the road that's going to be speaking in this series, she's an anthropologist also. She's done some work in very sort of economically depressed communities in Appalachia. And they're Orthodox communities that therefore have this sort of teaching in the background, but they got other things to worry about too. So she's going to kind of tackle this question of what do you do? How do you get people to actually do something with this and to do the thing that maybe they know is right, or whether it's this or any number of things. I don't have a good answer for you, but I think you're absolutely right to point to it as one of the absolute crucial questions. It's easy. Lots of people know what you're supposed to do, but it's hard. I buy this thing some days, but some days I got to buy the cheap thing, even though I know it's not the best thing, but that's the reality. So I think you're right to point to that as a major concern of how do these insights get people to change their behavior? Yeah. That's not satisfying, but if I solved that, I think I'd be running many think tanks, actually. Yeah, Sylvie.
I have a question not directly related to environmental theology, but about the Mashdots.
Yeah.
First of all, do other churches, these blessing of the fields and blessing of the grain and oil, and do other Orthodox churches, do they have these kind of prayers too? Does anybody know?
They do. I mean, I have not mapped, which specific ones we have that they don't have, and what, where the correspondences are. But there are sort of services of blessing that other churches have.
For things like this, for fields and wine and oil.
I believe there are definitely some, oriented towards different natural elements. I mean, Sir Bozan, you can speak to this better than I can.
Absolutely. Some of these are unique to the Armenian Church, but and not all of these are in current use or available in editions in other traditions the way they are in our church. So our Mashdots has the service for baptism, which every priest does a couple times a month at least, and next to it a prayer like this, which a service like this, which would be otherwise really has no use in modern life.
Right.
Right. It's interesting that one of the things that we've done here at St. Barton Cathedral, since I have the microphone, is we revived one of these old services, which is a periodic blessing of water for the sake of those that are sick. And it's not only for the sake of human beings that are sick, but animals that are sick, fields that are damaged. So we've focused on the human sickness side of it because there's a need for that, an immediate need for that among our people. But I kind of thought we need to bring people together and give them an opportunity to pray for themselves if they're sick and for others that are sick. And gosh, we've got this beautiful old ancient service in our books, and let's pull it out and use it.
So I was thinking too that, even 100 years ago, 500 years ago, of course, blessing your field was important. Nobody here has a field. Okay? I don't need my field blessed.
I mean, I got to say, Sylvie, though, when there's these set of litanies in the morning service, and one of them says, for like the sweet rains to come down. And I got to tell you, when I'm at home in Central California, in Yedem, California, where there's still grape farmers, man, I am like, when I say that little one, I'm like, especially in California with the drought, I'm just like, this one gets extra attention.
Well, I was just thinking that it was so much more important. It's still important. Water is important. Rain is important. But it was so much more important when you depended on your field to fill your belly.
Yeah.
And the vats of oil were important, especially all winter long or whatever.
I mean, we still are, just not the right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we've become distant
That's right.
from that through technology and
We're
other things.
distant, especially
So,
in New York.
one of the ways that we, make the gospel real and restore and revive faith in Jesus Christ is precisely by continually being reminded that, as a matter of fact, we really do need to pray for rain for the fields, right? I can still go to to Trader Joe and pick up what I need, but there is a continuity, there is a connection to a field somewhere that better have rain on it, and not to mention the fact that there are other people that don't have that ability of being able to just run across the street 24/7.
I just have something that you mentioned about fasting.
Yeah.
But do Armenians fast at other times other than the Easter? I mean, you said something about Tuesdays and Wednesdays.
Wednesdays and Fridays traditionally. So in a kind of throughout most of the year, there are the Armenian liturgical calendar is a complex joy in its own right. But on your average week, yes, Wednesday and Friday is a fasting day on most weeks of the year, as well as, in addition to Lent, other sort of shorter periods of fasting that don't that aren't the full 40 days. But we actually, are we in it this week or was it last week? Yeah, this week is it's a kind of preliminary fast that actually is, part of the practical part of it is that it's going to prepare your body to sort of be ready to actually be able to fast for 40 days coming up in a few weeks. So this is a week-long fast that we're in right now as well. So yes.
How many people here are fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays?
Yeah, it's Wednesday. There you go.
Not me.
Or no, it's Thursday tonight. No, it's not. What?
Catholics do it on Friday.
Yeah, well, and actually, if in one of the quotes I read from one of the Orthodox theologians, he mentions, and the rest of Orthodox Christians also fast on the twice, weekly prescribed days. So this is an old practice shared between a lot of the ancient churches, having sort of days of fasting on an average week.
And do you mean by fasting like not eating anything all day or not eating meat or
different. I mean, different people would have done it differently. The sort of the traditional Armenian fast is that sort of Lenten vegan fast, and a fasting day would be basically that Lenten vegan fast, as I understand it, probably.
Most certainly were those that fasted completely from all food. They put nothing in their mouths all day until nighttime when they had a little vegan something. That's a traditional full fast. And it's funny how nowadays modern medicine is beginning to prescribe periodic fasting for periods of time as a way to restore health.
Well, the wine is not in vats, so hopefully the vats won't break. But there is wine in the back, as well as food and water and many other good, wonderful natural things. I know it was kind of dense, but I wanted to lay these things out. We've got a whole series of other things that people will take it a little bit slower than I did. But I truly believe that this is something that the Armenian Church can contribute. So I hope that I've convinced you as well. And if not, you can argue with me over wine.
And just allow me, I'm the bishop, I'm allowed to get up and speak whenever I want in my cathedral. I just want to congratulate and thank Deacon Dr. Chris for this wonderful series and for inaugurating it and for all of your good work. What touches my heart deeply in this whole area, this topic is the question that you asked, you sort of put it out there, is this is all wonderful and there's enormous if we could say, material here to harvest from our tradition. Who's going to do that? Who's going to do that? We're in a society now, as American Armenians, where to consider sending your son or daughter to the seminary to study and to have the tools to be able to look into this material and perhaps make a contribution not only to our people but to the world and to contemporary issues that are a matter of life and death, is sadly no longer considered to be something virtuous or valued, as it was once upon a time. There's lots of reasons for that. But I feel morally obliged to thank people like Deacon Tim, who's a graduating seminarian, and Deacon Eric and Deacon Chris for their valiant efforts, and Sylvia in your own area of expertise, and others as well. So there's lots of work to be done here, and we have an obligation, at the very least, as Armenians, to promote and to encourage our young people to enter these areas of expertise and learn the languages and the theology and the tools and the enormous wealth that is there for us to harvest. I would have called your topic, what was your name? Towards an
environmental theology.
So I would have said harvesting an environmental theology.
There you go.
Thank you, Chris, most of all.
Thank you so much.